A brother in seat happened to commit a fault, and the elders assembled and sent for Abbot Moses to join them. He, however, did not want to come. The priest sent him a message saying, "Come, the community of the brethren is waiting for you." So he arose and started off, and taking with him a very old basket full of holes, he filled it with sand and carried it behind him. The elders came out to meet him and said, "What is this, Father?" And the elder replied, "My sins are running out behind me, and I do not see them. And today I come to judge the sins of another." They, hearing this, said nothing to the brother, but pardoned him. This little teaching from the sayings of the Desert Fathers, it gets us quickly to the heart of our commitment and practice of faults and affirmations. So I'd encourage you to go back and watch the video from Postulancy on faults and affirmations if you need a refresher. And we have an explanation of faults and affirmations, of course, in our Rule of Life. That's another way to get this in front of you as you sit with it and review. So this year, we've mostly been thinking about our rule of life through the lens of asceticism, the spiritual training that we undergo in the life of our formation, sort of intentionally putting on some practices and sometimes maybe even some rigorous practices, things that feel like they stretch us, so that we can have revealed to us our weakness and our need of God, and so that we can receive the grace and the mercy of God to help us. That's what asceticism is all about. And much of the time when people are thinking about asceticism, they think of asceticism as it relates to their body, like fasting or getting up in the middle of the night to pray. These are both historic forms of asceticism that draw on the natural weakness of our body and can quickly put us into a place of need of God's grace and kindness and presence. But mostly, the ascetical tradition is focused on some aspect of training the soul. And so if you imagine the soul as a muscle or a set of different muscles, there is some sense in which we have specific exercises to get at specific muscles that we want to train in our soul. And so in the practice of faults and affirmations, we're training a muscle, so to speak, in our soul that trains us towards more easily getting really honest about what is so of us, what's true of us. What are the unhealed places within me? Where do I get stirred up towards the things that lead me away from God or God's work in my life? Or what are the ways that we're currently wrapped up in the passions, like those basic desires like anger and envy and lust and greed, and acedia, which is that part of us that feels completely stuck, like sort of motionless or listless, or maybe just pride. So when we're practicing faults and affirmations, particularly when we're confessing our faults, saying out loud where we're struggling or how we're failing to live in a way that God is inviting us to live, it trains that part of our soul that pushes against pride. And so we regularly come to speak out loud the ways that we notice that we aren't actually living into the life that God is inviting us into, which means we're getting some regular routine of being able to normalize the simple fact that we're human beings, that we're not yet what we're meant to be. And if we could just pause, and if we could just see the ways that we live with this gap between who God is calling me to be and how He is forming me into His likeness, and the reality of where I'm at right now. And if I can just notice that in God's presence, I am completely loved, and I can say that stuff out loud without any shame in the presence of another, then I'm sort of cutting off at the knees any part of me that would want to take pride in my own efforts. And the question, of course, is how does this do the work of any formation? And more specifically, and those of you who are in our course of study as part of your novitiate, you might want to think a little bit more about this related to your course of study, but how does this practice of faults and affirmations train us ultimately towards love of others? Love of others requires us to be able to see others for who they are and to love them for who they are. And I don't know about you, but this is probably one of the biggest challenges in my own formation. I think I love people pretty well. But and here is a bit of a confession from me, I think there is something at work in me that is fairly consistently wanting the people around me to act differently, to be different, to do things my way, and to change. I want to change them into the image of who I want them to be. So there's my confession. And it's not there all of the time, but the biggest obstacles for me in loving other people, if I'm really honest, is that I want other people to conform to how I want them to be. I hope that's okay to say out loud. There is something in me that gets stuck. And if we dig a little deeper, what we'd likely see in me is some form of pride at work that desires others to be different than they are, simply put. But as I grow in compassion for myself and all of the ways that I am not currently the person that I want to be, or more specifically, the person that I believe that God is asking me to be, or the person who I am trusting that God will make me as I grow in compassion for that gap inside of me, it's quite a bit easier to grow in compassion for the gap that I see in other people. To trust that it's God's work in them to make them what He is making them. So if I'm regularly in touch with my own faults, then I get to the point where I'm like, I'm going to accuse another and my own sins run out behind me, just like that saying in the Desert Fathers. So one of my favorite writers, Father Jacques Philippe, he says something along the lines that our faults and our awareness of those faults can become a source of tenderness and mercy towards others. I, who fall so easily, how can I permit myself to judge my brother? How can I not be merciful toward him as the Lord has been towards me? That's how this works. So this is the posture that Jesus actually leads us towards in His teaching about the plank in my own eye and the speck of sawdust in the eye of another. Jesus says, take out the plank in your eye. Okay, so how would I do that? So there is some intentionality here. I have to see what inside of me could possibly be at work in blocking my vision of seeing the goodness in others. And once I see it, and once I see it for what it is, so in my case, probably a good deal of pride, and then once I confess it, whatever had me judgmental of someone else, whatever speck of sawdust I might see in someone else, it sort of loses its power because I've just dealt with a giant, plank in my own eye. And so the practice of sharing faults gets us really clear about what is true of us. It helps us see ourselves really clearly. And then when we bring in the practice of affirmations, we are intentionally are now present to the good in other people. We're training our eye towards the good of others. And ideally, they are practicing seeing the good in us. That's their job. So most of us do not need help seeing the ways that we aren't measuring up to some standard. This is not to say, of course, that we can't hold people accountable or push on them a little bit towards becoming who they're becoming. There's room for confrontation and there's room for accountability. But most people need help seeing the good that God is doing in them. And friends, I would love for us to be the kind of people in the order of the common life who are regularly showing up in one another's life and speaking out loud the truth of what we see of God's work in one another. That's the affirmations part. And that we would become people that do this in the life of our family and in the life of our local church. So I've just recently had some conversation with my wife, Jamie, about leaning back into this practice. It's one that we have sort of fallen off of a bit. As our kids have gotten older into those teenage years, we're sort of around our table less with our older kids than we used to be. And that was really the place where we had sort of habituated ourselves into the practice. It's where we practiced it most. And I think the work that we did for years, it has paid off, and we're seeing that our kids are actually quite regularly aware and able to notice ways in which maybe they've responded in a way that they don't want to respond, or they're just very easy and quick to ask for forgiveness. And so this practice for me is shifting a bit. The formal practice of faults and affirmations is likely in this next season to primarily be between Jamie and I. We'll still kind of bring in our girls from time to time, and we are going to continue to try to lean into that. But I think that there's something shifting in my life. And so I just want to say that to say is that over time, we have to revisit these practices and orient them to the reality of our lives. So friends, if you haven't leaned into this practice yet, I would love to encourage you to do so. Could you just find one person to practice this with in this next month? Maybe one person where you could introduce this practice to. We'd love to help you figure out how to do that. Maybe you can talk through that some in your formation group. So there is, as always, some questions below for reflection. There's a link to the faults and affirmations section in our Rule of Life. Friends, we look forward to hearing how conversation goes within your formation groups. Much love and grace to you.